muffins! This guy's name is Gino.
And this gal's name is Julia.
And welcome to our weekly podcast,
A Slice of Life. A show where we talk about anything and everything for your entertainment.
Now, this week's podcast will be all about public speakers.
Now, Gino, I'm sure you know everything about public speaking, right? I've heard from many sources that you're really into this, right?
I wouldn't say I'm an expert at public speaking, but I've had some of my experiences with public speaking, namely with Intrams 2017 and 2019, I think, when I won the extemporaneous contests in the STEC intramurals, and also with my experience with the debate competition from last year. I'm not sure if you could consider that as public speaking, but why not, you know?
That's pretty great.
Now, for the first person, I'm going to talk about it, right? Okay. Now, for this person, have you ever heard of the name Harry Baker?
I think he's familiar, but I haven't really gone through much of his work yet.
Okay, so Harry Baker is the World Poetry Slam Poetry Grand Champion of 2012. Now, you might think 2012, that's been like maybe 8 years?
8 years, I think. 8 years, yeah.
It's been 8 years too long, but why now have I gained inspiration from him? Now, if you see his TED Talks, when it comes to his poems, it is incredible. Now, Harry Baker is the type of person who you'd think that they don't look the part of what a poetry-inclined person would be, right? Now, that is slightly true because he was a maths major before he got really into poetry itself. Now, while I was watching his TED Talk, he presented 3 poems that he wrote, and I was just astonished. The way he captured his audience in the first few minutes of the TED Talk itself, where he says, "I'm Harry Baker. Harry Baker is my name. If you have a name called Harry Baker, we have the same name." Now, you might think of this as something awkward, but I think it's a way that he actually connects with his audience and makes them understand what it feels to be on the stage with him, like as if it was an awkward situation. But he used this to his advantage and actually gained the audience trust by making fun of himself, but not necessarily in a bad way. Now, onto the poem. There was this poem that really struck a part in me.
Have you ever heard of the poem called Paper People?
I think it's familiar, I think.
So, if you don't know, Paper People is one of the greatest poems Harry Baker has ever written, which made him win the Grand Champion, in 2012. Now, in this poem, it presents itself in a conundrum, wherein it's a literary genius in itself because of the way he wrote it, it is rhythmical and it is very resonating in what's actually really happening. But at first time you listen to it, it's plainly confusing, wherein you just hear just the word P repeated and repeated and repeated, and basically, at first, you just wouldn't get it, but once you really get into it, you'd understand that there was a deeper meaning into it, and where he actually uses confusion in itself and brings and draws the audience closer. And I think that's just an amazing way of presenting how good of a poet you are. Do you agree with me?
Yep.
For my slice of thought, I think that if you have the way to capture your audience at first few minutes on the stage, then whatever you say, whatever you might do, your audience will always be there to just wait and just be enticed by you, right?
Yep, definitely.
And yeah, that's mine. So how about you, Gene?
For my slice of thought, as you've said, his way of speaking is really peculiar, and the way he presents is really interesting, right? And I think that's also key to a lot of new public speakers, and because an audience won't necessarily focus on someone if all they're speaking it's really monotone. Their whole speech is
Definitely.
monotone. It's very boring. But the way Harry Baker speaks and the way he presents his speech is really interesting because he cracks jokes and he's kind of funny too. So like it makes the audience want to listen to him. And I think that's something you should always keep in mind as a public speaker. So keep that in mind, guys.
We're gonna take a short break and we'll be right back.
So now let's talk about another spectacular public speaker. He was actually the world champion of public speaking in the Toastmasters competition in 2015. Do you know who this is, Julia?
I think I've never heard of him.
So, well, his name's actually Mohammed Katani. Is that familiar?
Definitely not.
Well, he was, as I've mentioned, the world champion of public speaking in the Toastmasters competition in 2015, but he actually joined Toastmasters in 2019. And he was actually born mute, and at the age of 6, he started developing his speech. However, he still had stutter, but he never let any of this hinder his progress and his goals of wanting to become a public speaker, a successful public speaker. And as I've mentioned, he is really successful. But now I'm going to talk about this particular speech of his winning speech titled The Power of Words. Right? We've seen the video, right? It was definitely interesting. But let me talk about how he presents his speech. First off, he gets his audience on his side. He opens his speech with a joke, the whole smoking joke. And some of the audience were shocked by it and some were laughing by it. And that's one way to get the audience relate to you is by being funny and charismatic. And once you get the audience laughing, you've got them on your side, Katani says. And he also doesn't lose sight of his message, despite his jokes, despite his storytelling. His message is still intact. He has one particular message which he would like to tell, and this is the power of words. The power of words, in which how when you speak to someone, how it can greatly impact and affect someone. Not only with the way you speak, but also the content of your words itself. So he never loses sight of this message. He keeps his point across. Right? And also, he makes it personal. The way he spoke his speech, he told stories. He told the story of his late friend, and he also tells a story about his life. And that's what got the audience to relate to him, is because he made it really personal, and the audience could relate to it. And that's another way to get the audience on your side. And also, he ends on a hopeful note. He told tragic stories of sadness, but he also ends his speech on a hopeful note. He says, however you determine your speech will flow, it's important that you always leave your audience with a feeling of hope. And he did just that with his speech. And I think that's very amazing and such a peculiar way and a great advice to all those public speakers or aspiring public speakers who would want to take notes from legends like Mr. Katani. So now moving on to our slice of thought. As I've mentioned, he opens his speech with a joke which got the audience to relate to him, and he also ends it on a hopeful note, which gives the audience hope. And that's always important, to keep your relationship or your dynamic with the audience to be really constant and really consistent. Because if the audience is on your side, your speech, the message of your speech, would be more impactful to them and would be more what do you call this? Would be more heartfelt to them. You can understand me? Yeah.
Of course I do. And from my side, I think I absolutely agree with everything that Gina says, because one of the main things a public speaker should have is a way that they can capture their audience so that there would actually be someone who's listening to them, right? And yeah, that's my slice of thought. I really do agree with everything you said. So that's it for today's episode. And thank you, Muffins, for tuning in to this week's podcast episode.
Tune in next week to watch us talk about comedians.
So this guy's been Gino.
And this girl's Julia. And this has been A Slice, of Life.
See you
See you next week, everyone.